Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. 30 minutes, one guest, no cuts. What we record is what you get. Will Chris Hipkins earn himself a chunky chapter in the story of New Zealand political leadership, or will he remain a footnote? A man who took over as Prime Minister from Jacinda Ardern but never really stamped his mark on the ninth floor of the Beehive. He has taken some significant steps this year, beginning to lay out Labour's economic vision, with policies including a future fund using dividends from state-owned enterprises to invest in New Zealand business and biting the bullet to campaign on a capital gains tax. But what is Chris Hipkins really about? Where would he take the country? And how would he wrangle a coalition of the left? Let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Chris Hipkins. Chris Hipkins, welcome to 30.
Thank you.
Let's start with something far away geographically, but see whether it resonates ideologically. Zoran Mamdani, a socialist, has won the New York mayoralty in Trump's America. What is the message you take from that?
The message I take from that is there is a big backlash against the system at the moment. People feel like the economic system isn't working for them and they're looking for alternatives. We've had 4 or 5 decades around the world now of an economic system that says, don't worry about concentration of wealth, eventually that will flow down, everyone will be better off. And a lot of people are looking at that going, that's not us. That's not what we're experiencing. The cost of living's getting more. We're feeling more marginalised economically. Our jobs are less secure, and they want something different.
So do you see yourself as part of that momentum, as part of an alternative like the one that he is offering?
New Zealand's in a different position to the US. We're not as polarised as they are in the US, and I'm very grateful for that, and I hope we never get to that point. Yeah, I've travelled in the United States, including recently, and you'll find there that people just won't associate with people who have a different political view at all. And we don't have that in New Zealand. I think it's great that we can still at least associate with people who have a different view to us, and I hope we always keep that. So the hunger for that, in the way we're seeing in New York is different to the political pressures and the political aspirations we're seeing in New Zealand.
Sure, but you gave the initial answer to me that much of the world sees the economic system we have, of capitalism really, as broken for them, and that's why they're celebrating or getting behind someone like Zoran Mamdani. He's offering bold alternatives to cost of living crises. You've talked about the cost of living crisis. Do you find his kind of alternative compelling? He's talked about taking real action on food pricing, on rent and housing and public transport and minimum wage. Are you in the same ballpark as offering the kinds of bold initiatives that he is looking at?
Every country's in a different position. The US, many of the things that they talk about in the US, and that he's been talking about, we have here in New Zealand already. So we already have a public health system, a public education system. We have many of our public services delivered by the state here in New Zealand in a way that they're not necessarily there.
Yeah, but he's talking about things like food. He's talking about city-owned supermarkets, which would be, in the New Zealand context, state-owned supermarkets. Are you interested in ideas like that?
I wouldn't go to state-owned supermarkets as the first port of call, but coming back to the problem definition, which I think he has identified, the modern economy has trended towards far too many monopolies. And so here in New Zealand, we do see the same pressure. So our supermarkets, we have the supermarket duopoly controlling a huge proportion of our food supply. Is that something we can sustain as a small country? No, I don't think it is.
So what are you going to do about that?
Well, we'll have some further policy around competition. We've got some further policy to come on that.
Do you?
Yeah, absolutely, because New Zealand is not a competitive economy in many areas.
So if we stick on food for a second, supermarkets for a second, are you offering and promising New Zealanders that in some way, you don't have to give me all the detail today, but you are going to break up that monopoly, you're going to challenge that to bring food prices down for New Zealanders?
We need to see more competition in a range of areas, and food is one of them.
Are you going to do something about that?
Yes, we will, but I'm not announcing any new policy today, but yes, we will do more in that area because I don't think we can sustain what we have now.
He calls himself a democratic socialist. Is that a label that you would be happy with?
I don't really have a problem with the title. Democrat, socialist, variants of the same thing.
That's you?
People who believe that there is a more active role for the state. Yes, I do.
That's you?
I believe there's a more active role for the state, absolutely.
You're happy to call yourself a socialist?
People get hung up on the title, but do I believe there's a more active role for the state, which is a fundamental underpinning of socialism, social democracy? Yes, I do.
So that's not a label that you're frightened of?
Not particularly, no.
No. When you went into coalition with Winston Peters in 2017, on the night, and you'll remember it well, where he basically handed Jacinda Ardern the premiership, and he said, and you'll remember this quote, "Far too many New Zealanders have come to view today's capitalism not as their friend, but as their foe, and they're not all wrong. Capitalism must regain its responsible human face." That seems to resonate with you, because you gave me a similar kind of description at the beginning of that interview. Do you agree with that sentiment that he expressed on that night?
I did, and I was actually really excited to hear him say those words on that night, and I thought, goodness me, this is going to be quite an exciting ride.
And there's a but here, isn't there?
There is a but there, because many of the things that we could have done as a government that would have given effect to those words, New Zealand First subsequently were then blocking. So
what, like?
A better deal for workers, for example, improved working conditions for workers, fair pay agreements. That was blocked by New Zealand First. Work to make our tax system fairer, including the introduction of a capital gains tax. That was blocked by New Zealand First. So I think that a lot of what Winston Peters said when he made that announcement got me and many other people excited. And then 3 years later, he was boasting about the fact that he'd been the handbrake that had stopped all those things happening.
So you are promising to pursue capitalism with a human face?
I want to see New Zealand's economy better serving working New Zealanders. There are a lot of people in New Zealand working really hard at the moment who aren't feeling the benefits of that. We've improved, any improvement in our economic standard by and large in the last few decades has come from people working harder and from there being more people rather than from us being a more productive economy.
And what do you think about those ordinary people? What do you think they would think about the big four Australian-owned banks having a combined profit of about $5.3 billion a year and paying their CEOs between $3 and $5 million a year? We just saw the CEO of Westpac double her salary to $4 million. I mean, what can someone do at $5 million a year with $100,000 a week?
I think
are you comfortable to live in a society like that?
I think the profits that we're seeing from the banks, from the supermarkets, from the electricity companies, from some of the insurance companies are a sign that New Zealand doesn't actually have what the free market is supposed to deliver us, a competitive economy. You've got some big players who are ultimately able to make very, very large profits, exclude competition from the market, and New Zealand consumers and New Zealand citizens are ultimately the ones who pay the price for that.
So what would you do about that in terms of the banks? Because we've had endless numbers of reports. The Commerce Commission say that they're making excessive profits. What would you do about that?
Well, we've got more policy coming in that area as well, around competition, but also around banking.
Is it going to be tweaking though? Well, are you going to be tweaking or are you going to be bold?
One of the things we have to always remember, and this is one of the reasons that we have been going through a very comprehensive policy redevelopment, is the solutions that worked in the 20th century aren't going to be the things that are necessarily going to work in the 21st century. So if you take something like banking, for example, going back to the 20th century, it was about those big retail banks with branches in every town. Those branches are all closing up now, but there are new online banking options emerging around the world that aren't coming here into New Zealand. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why? Why aren't we getting the competition that they're seeing in other countries here in New Zealand? And it isn't just about what the existing banks are doing. They're operating within the market as it's established now. It's how can we change that so that we actually get more competition?
Should those big four banks be worried about the potential election of a Labor-led government?
I think anyone who is making a large amount of money from monopolistic behaviour should be worried about a future Labor government, because we want to see more choice for New Zealanders. We want to see a genuinely competitive economy. We want to see Kiwis getting a better deal.
So you're going to break up those monopolies of the banks and the supermarkets?
Well, when you say something like break up, you're suggesting that maybe we go in and intervene in individual companies. That's a big step to take. Can we get more competitive markets through better regulation, through making sure we're opening up space for new players in the markets where they are currently dominated by monopolies? Will we be active in that area? Absolutely.
If we look at the size of the state, I mean, you said in a 2024 speech, the ruthless attack on government workers has been heartless and cruel. So do you plan to return the size of the state to where it was, or had it become too bloated under Labor?
Rather than focusing on what the size of the state should be, we should ask the question, what do we want the state to do? Because by focusing simply on an arbitrary size of the state, whether it's 30% of GDP, 32% of GDP, whatever number you pick, you're ignoring some of the underlying pressure that the government's facing. As our population gets older, as our health system comes under more pressure as a result of that, the level of government spending relative to the population, relative to the size of the economy, will have to increase simply just to continue to do exactly what we're doing now. Nothing new, nothing extra. It's just with that demographic pressure coming through the system, that is going to cost the government more.
So the size of the state will grow again under Labor?
Well, the question has to be, what do we want the state to do? Do we want the state to provide good healthcare? Yes. Do we want the state to provide security in retirement? Yes. If you want to do just those things, then that is going to necessitate an increase in the size of government spending relative to GDP, or it's going to require significant extra economic growth, which thus far we haven't achieved.
Or more taxation?
Well, if you're going to meet the need, that all has to be funded. Somehow you have to fund all of those things.
Okay, we'll come to that in a second. Let's talk about one of those options, which is borrowing. Does New Zealand have a debt problem right now, do you think?
New Zealand has an underinvestment problem in a lot of areas. So if you take something like infrastructure, we need to fund the cost of infrastructure upgrades up front because we need to build more of it. How can we fund that? We cannot fund that through day-to-day taxation and day-to-day user charges. We are going to have to fund that over a period of time. How do we do that? Well, government borrowing is the way that you do that. Now, there are a variety of ways that you can structure that borrowing, but the current government aren't proposing anything fundamentally different. So even a PPP, so they say, well, we'll just do more PPPs. Government, that's still a form of government borrowing. It still appears on the government balance sheet as a form of borrowing.
Okay, I mean, Crown debt is predicted or forecast to rise to about 45% of GDP by the end of 2029. I mean, is that a level that you are comfortable with?
The level that I'm comfortable with is about, I think the conversation that I'm comfortable with is about what are we borrowing for. So if we're borrowing to fund our day-to-day living as a country, then that's not something we can sustain in the long term. But if we are borrowing to invest in our infrastructure, as they did after the Second World War, New Zealand borrowed heavily after the Second World War to rebuild our economy in the wake of a massive global conflict. And we all inherited the assets that were built up during that time from that investment. They were paid off over subsequent generations. That's the sort of conversation we need to have.
So are you going to set a ceiling, though, and say, well, debt can't go above 45% of GDP or 50% of GDP or whatever it is? Are you going to set a ceiling?
All governments need to set rules and I guess guidelines around how they are going to manage.
And can you give us a rough idea of where you would be on that metric?
The current government are going to have to increase the level of debt if they're going to build all the stuff they've said. $55 billion worth of roads aren't going to pay for themselves. The government's going to have to fund those somehow. So I have said that when the government release their next budget, at that point we will then be very clear on how we would differ from that. But at this point, the government still have a lot of questions about how they're going to pay for the commitments they've already made.
Sure, but we get told that debt servicing is a real problem, and you look at debt servicing, it's about $9.5 billion a year in the current financial year. Sounds like a big number, but we collect as a government $170 billion, right? So that would be like a household earning $170,000 and paying $9,500 in interest, which if you look at it in that sphere, it doesn't sound so scary. I'm just trying to get a sense from you about whether you are happy to see debt increase or whether you think we've got a real issue and need to constrain that.
As I've said, even the current government are going to have to increase debt, or they're going to have to break all of the promises that they have made. You can't fund $55 billion worth of roads, which is exactly what they have pledged to do, without an increase in borrowing. The money just isn't there to pay for those.
But you would be happy
upfront.
for debt to grow a little bit under Labour?
Again, it depends what the debt is for.
Yes, you've
So
made
if it
that
is-
point. If it is for infrastructure, you are prepared to allow debt to go higher?
If the debt is for productive investment, which includes infrastructure, then yes. If it is for day-to-day consumption, the government can't go on doing that indefinitely. You do need to balance that part of the government's accounts.
Okay, let's talk about the economy a little more broadly. And firstly, would Barbara Edmonds definitely be Finance Minister under a Labour-led government?
Absolutely. It's an absolute bottom line.
Is that right? So it's no one from the Greens or Te Pāti Māori, it's Barbara Edmonds?
Barbara Edmonds would be the Minister of Finance if I was the Prime Minister. There's absolutely no question about it.
One of your ideas to grow the economy is this future fund idea. Now, under that scheme, do all the shares of the SOEs go into that fund, do they? Is that how it works?
We'll set out which companies are in and out after the election, and there's a reason.
After the election?
After the election, there's reasons for that, because some of them are publicly listed companies, and there are issues that you'd have to work through around the markets around that. But the assets that go in they'll generate a return because they generate dividends. Rather than the government extracting those dividends will be reinvested.
Yes. And will it mean that they can't be sold?
That's the plan. So the plan is to move the government from being a short-term investor to being a long-term investor in those assets. So both the state-owned enterprises model, which was established in the 80s, and the mixed ownership model, which was established under the Key government, were stepping stones to the full sale of those assets. We're saying we don't want to do that. We want to hold them long-term. We want the government to be a long-term investor in those assets.
Even for assets like Pāmu or Landcorp, I mean, why do we need to have state-owned farms?
Well, if you look at Pāmu and Landcorp, good examples, they do buy and sell farms, but overall, they play a very strategically important part in New Zealand's economy. Pāmu and Landcorp farms are often where there's a lot of research and development that takes place on those farms that's supported by the New Zealand public for the broader benefits of the entire farming community. So there's a strategically important reason for the government to be involved there. And in other cases, they're protecting strategically important land for the whole country.
Let's talk about inequality. What plans have you got, if any, to reduce inequality in New Zealand?
I think it's important that we start at the grassroots there. We've got to make sure we're giving kids the very best possible start in life. So you can expect to see more from us on areas around supporting families, on areas around early childhood education, heading through into schooling education. I have said that our priorities as a government will be jobs, health, homes and cost of living, because all of those areas are the essential building blocks for a good life in New Zealand. And coming back to child poverty, every one of those touches on child poverty.
Would your capital gains tax reduce inequality, do you think?
Not immediately. Over time, a move away from over-reliance on the housing market, I think should put the dream of home ownership back on the table for more Kiwi families. At the moment, that's trending downwards. We've gone from very high rates of home ownership in New Zealand to what will be very low rates of home ownership if our current trend continues. And I'm not willing to see that. If we want kids to grow up in secure homes, their parents should have a good chance of being able to buy those homes.
Is the capital gains tax the only significant tax change you're going to make, or are there others that you're working away on?
As I've said, issues around wealth tax off the table. So we've said that's off the table. In terms of capital gains tax, the simple targeted capital gains tax is what we're proposing.
Sure.
There are still a few other issues that we're working through which we'll set out in our fiscal plan, which includes what we will do around some of the changes the current government have made, so things like the tax breaks they gave to tobacco companies and to landlords. We'll set that out in our fiscal plan.
You're going to reverse the tax breaks for tobacco companies, I presume?
I think that's a fairly safe assumption.
So you will raise those taxes again?
Well, that was a tax break to the tobacco companies on the basis of some very, very questionable advice that isn't going to be better for New Zealand's health as a country.
And so you're putting those tobacco companies on notice, or one in particular, that's going to change?
Yeah, it's one tobacco company that by and large has got the vast bulk of the benefit from that, and that is going to change.
no ifs, no buts, no maybes. That's going to change.
Well, we'll set out exactly what that looks like in the fiscal plan, but tax cuts for tobacco companies is inexcusable in the current environment that we're in.
And landlords?
We'll set out the detail of what we'll do differently there when we release our fiscal plan.
So you could tweak that and go, say, you can do claim 50% or whatever the number is.
So we're still working through all of that.
But is it that kind
we actually haven't made that decision yet. So we're still working through that.
What about the personal tax rate changes? You know, are you going to, say, lift the top rates of personal income tax for wealthier New Zealanders, for example? Is that on the table?
It's not something that we've looked at this point. Obviously, the government...
Are you ruling it out?
No, it's not something that we've looked at this point.
Let's be clear on this. Sorry to interrupt, but let's be clear on this and nail this down. So you are still open to considering changes to personal income tax rates?
Well, the current government have foreshadowed that they want to do more personal income tax cuts.
I'm asking you, though. I'm asking about you.
But the reason that we can't answer that now is we don't know what the current government might propose between now and then. They've got a whole nother budget cycle to go.
But are you open to it? I mean, it's 39 cents on income over 180,000 at the moment, isn't it? Are you open to saying, well, actually, we need to tax wealthy people more to do the kinds of things that you've been talking about in this interview?
It's not even something that we have looked at this point.
But you're open to it?
We'll set out very clearly before the next election any changes around tax that we make.
You.
Because
hang on.
Tax is a very controversial issue and people have very strong views on it, which is why we'll set that out before the election.
Yeah, but are you open to doing it?
We'll set out a personal income tax policy once we see what the government's income tax policy is.
Yeah, but you're not ruling it out, are you?
Well, you can't rule things in and out until you see what the current government are doing, and they've got another budget in which to do that.
So it's still on the table?
Well, if the current government were to campaign on significant personal income tax cuts at this point, I think that would be irresponsible. And so, yes, we would change that.
What about the business tax rate? I mean, is there a case to reduce it from 28%?
If you look at other countries, and I've looked at a bit at this, if you look at, say, the UK, they looked at what happened in Ireland when Ireland reduced their corporate tax rate. They did the same in the UK, and they ended up putting it back up again because it didn't deliver the sort of economic benefits that they'd been looking at.
Did you align it? I was thinking about this when I was preparing for this interview. Did you align that, because your capital gains tax rate is 28%, isn't it?
That's correct.
So did you align it with the business tax rate? Is that why you picked 28%?
The business tax rate and the pie rate. So for investments and
so you ain't going to tinker with the business tax rate then, are you?
No, it's not on the cards for us.
No. We talked about inequality. We talked about those at the bottom of the pile, really, in society, and you've talked about wanting to lift their prospects. Are benefits enough to live on, or would Labor raise the level of the benefit?
It's very, very hard to live on a benefit, and there are too many people who are in benefit-dependent households, too many kids growing up in benefit-dependent households. I think we need to create more jobs so that those families have jobs to go into. We need to deal with issues around those who are long-term dependent on benefits of some sort.
Sure, but what about the level of the benefit? Would you raise it?
We had previously signalled that we were going to adjust it by wage growth rather than by the rate of inflation, and the National Party have reversed that change. We haven't finalised a policy on that for the next election.
Just looking this week at a number of people saying that New Zealand is broken, and I've seen columns and I've seen that sentiment expressed. And I saw the clinical psychologist Jackie Maguire say on a New Zealand Herald podcast that about a third of New Zealand adults experience anxiety or depression weekly, up 25% from 5 years ago. She said, data doesn't lie, people feel broken. Do you feel that New Zealand is broken at the moment?
There are two issues in there. One is whether New Zealand's broken, and the other is issues around mental health and stress and well-being.
Let's take the first one.
There are definitely parts of New Zealand that are broken.
What do you mean by that?
Well, much of our infrastructure is broken.
Sure. But I'm talking about the soul. I'm talking about how people feel at the moment.
So then you're actually talking about the second issue, which is around that mental well-being area. And New Zealand is not immune from the pressure that's happening around the rest of the world as well. We're living in a far more pressured environment than any, I think, human generations have lived in before. Things like social media, the digital economy, it has just added this relentless pressure onto people's lives. And everybody's feeling that. I've followed with real interest what they've done in Australia, for example, just with a relatively simple law around the right to disconnect. The right that says that when you go home and you finish your working day, you're allowed to say you finished your working day. I think they're speaking to this very issue, that people are connected 24/7 now, and that means including being connected to work 24/7. And the pressure is relentless.
And some of this is driven by AI at the moment, and it will increasingly be driven by AI. Our attitude here in New Zealand seems to be similar to the US, which is basically just let it rip. Do you think when you see people developing AI friends and using AI for therapy with mixed results, including some disastrous ones, do you think we need to regulate there, or are you happy to let AI go and let it rip as we are?
I haven't actually looked at that particular issue around, simulated friendships and all of those sorts of things.
They're real, though. You must have seen...
There are definitely AI tools that have the potential to make our lives better. And we announced...
So you're pretty comfortable with that?
We announced, for example, the rollout of more AI tools for our health system last week, because they have the potential to actually improve human-to-human interactions. If you're taking some of the paperwork away and having AI doing that, then actually you can have more in-person interactions with a real human being.
Sure, no one doubts that there are real gains to be made from AI, but there are real risks as well. You don't feel that we need to regulate to any greater degree?
I think what it shows, Guyon, and it might be a slight deviation from the question you've asked, I think what it highlights is that philosophy is going to be more important in the future than ever before, because
philosophy is,
as we grapple with some of the huge dilemmas that AI is going to pose for us, our philosophers are going to start to become pretty damn important.
Or will we turn to AI for that?
Well, no, because you have to. AI is still, unless AI develops sentience, which no one has suggested it's going to. Well, people have suggested it's going to, but there isn't any scientific evidence that it's going to. Then human beings are still going to ultimately be the ones who program the outcomes of AI.
Do you use it?
Yeah, I do.
What for?
Oh, largely just as a sort of a search engine for collating and pulling together information.
I want to spend the last few minutes of this interview talking about coalitions and how you might bring together a government if you were in that position. Do you see Te Pāti Māori being able to take executive positions in a Labour-led government? Or can you sit here today and say, well, actually, we'd take their support from the crossbench, but they wouldn't be part of a Labour-led government, and what I mean by that is the executive, ministerial positions? They're
a long way away from having those kind of conversations at this point. They really need to sort themselves out first, make sure that they're focused on, the interests of the people who voted for them, the interests of all New Zealanders, which is not where their focus is at the moment.
Well, let's take that as the first staging post, if you like. So if it was a position where you had to form a government now, you're saying they're not ready for that?
My goal is to grow Labour's vote share as much as I possibly can.
We know all that. But also, you deserve to signal, your voters, your supporters want to get a signal and a sign about where you might go and what you might be able to do in terms of how you can work with a party like that.
The message that I have sent to Te Pāti Māori is that I want the next government that I lead to be a government for all New Zealanders, one that's focused on unity and not division. And I think some of the messaging that they have been sending out, unfortunately, has the potential to stoke division. So, Takuta Ferris's comments were very, very offensive to...
This is when he said that blacks or Asians or Pākehās shouldn't be trying to help someone win a Māori seat.
And that was really alienating for a lot of people. A lot of people who have Toi Tuta Treaty stickers on their car bumpers were saying, is he saying that I have to take this sticker off my car now? There's goodwill. You've got to have goodwill. And unfortunately, those kind of statements just corrode goodwill. And I don't want that sort of sentiment anywhere near any government that I lead.
Well, but your opponents are going to lump you in with the Māori Party, aren't they? You know exactly how that's going to work, right? Well, so how are you going to sequester that?
But look, people who live in glass houses need to be careful at how big of rocks they throw. You've got Winston Peters and David Seymour, and look at the inflammatory comments that they were making before the last election, and Christopher Luxon was quite happy not only to go into government with them, but basically to let them call all the shots in government. I'm not willing to do that. I still think under MMP, you need to respect the voting public's decision. And my goal is to get Labor to the largest share of vote possible.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean that the small parties should then call all the shots.
So is it possible that you would work with New Zealand First and Winston Peters if you were trying to form a government in 2026?
I'll set that out closer to the election. I'll set out which...
He's kind of ruled you out though, hasn't it? Is that how you take it?
It'll be a principled position, and it'll be based on the compatibility we see with other parties in terms of the program that we want to put before the public.
He's ruled you out though, hasn't he? He said that he won't work with Labor if Christopher Hipkins is the leader.
Winston Peters is notoriously difficult to deal with, but there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge before the next election.
Have you talked to him?
Run into him now and then around the place.
And?
We've always had a very, cordial conversations.
So you don't think it's impossible that you could have a Labor New Zealand First government?
I try and have cordial relationships with everyone across the parliamentary divide. That doesn't mean that I would be going into government with them all, though.
No. Can you answer that final question, though? Is it possible in your head that we could have a New Zealand First Labor government?
I've said that we'll set that out closer to the election.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. That was 30 Minutes with Chris Hipkins. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time.